The words feel foreign on my tongue, jagged and bitter, like shards of glass cutting into the soft tissue of my soul. How do you even begin to process something so unimaginable? One moment, I was living a life I thought was perfect. A loving marriage, a thriving career, and a bond with my younger brother that I believed was unbreakable. The next, I discovered that everything I cherished had been built on a foundation of lies. It started with small signs, things I dismissed as paranoia or stress. Vivian, my wife of 5 years, began pulling away. Her laughter didn't reach her eyes anymore. She stopped meeting mine when we talked. And Rowan, my brother, who'd always been my confidant, grew distant too. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe they were both dealing with their own struggles. But deep down, a gnawing suspicion lingered, whispering truths I wasn't ready to face. Then came the day I found them together. I hadn't planned to go home early from work. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday. But there they were, in our kitchen, standing close enough for their shoulders to brush. The way Vivian looked at him, the tenderness in her gaze, the soft curve of her lips, it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. This was betrayal, raw and undeniable. For a split second, time froze. Their faces turned toward me, guilt flashing across their features like lightning before a storm. Then chaos erupted, accusations, tears, shattered promises. By the end of it, my world lay in ruins. My wife, the woman I loved more than anything, had chosen my own flesh and blood over me. And Rowan, who I'd trusted with my life, had taken the one thing I held sacred. To understand how this could happen, to fathom how love could twist into something so ugly, you need to know what we once had. Vivian and I weren't just husband and wife. We were partners in every sense of the word. From the moment we met at a mutual friend's art gallery opening, there was an undeniable spark between us. She wore a red dress that night, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like waves under moonlight. When she smiled at me, I felt like the luckier man alive. Our relationship blossomed quickly, fueled by late-night conversations about childhood dreams, shared playlists filled with songs only we understood, and spontaneous road trips to nowhere in particular. Every milestone felt monumental. The first time she cooked dinner for me, burnt pasta, but somehow perfect. The day she introduced me to her eccentric family. The moment she slipped a key to her apartment onto my keychain with a shy smile. Together, we imagined a future where weekends were spent exploring flea markets, evenings reserved for quiet dinners at home, and holidays celebrated surrounded by friends and laughter. Rowan was part of that vision too. Or so I thought. He and Vivian got along famously from the start, bonding over inside jokes and shared interests. They often teased me about my obsession with organization, calling me Captain Spreadsheet whenever I tried to plan vacations down to the minute. Back then, it all seemed harmless, even endearing. Looking back now, I realize those moments were seeds planted long before the betrayal took root. There were hints, of course, tiny fractures in the facade of our perfect life. Vivian started spending more time with Rowan, citing projects they were working on together. At first, I believed her. After all, Rowan was a graphic designer and Vivian ran her own boutique. Collaborating made sense. But over time, their excuses became flimsier, their absences more frequent. Once I caught them laughing over coffee at a cafe near Vivian's shop. When I asked what was so funny, they exchanged a glance that sent a chill down my spine. "Nothing," Vivian said quickly, her tone light but forced. "Just silly stuff." Rowan nodded, avoiding my gaze. "Yeah, nothing important." Even then, I let it slide, convincing myself I was overreacting. Trust is a fragile thing, easily shaken, but hard to rebuild. So I buried my doubts, focusing instead on the life we'd created, the life I believed was ours. But denial can only shield you for so long. Beneath the surface, cracks widened until the entire structure collapsed. And when it did, the fallout was catastrophic. If you're invested in this story and want to find out how I navigated the aftermath of this devastating betrayal, don't forget to hit that like button below. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or predictions. I'd love to hear what you think will happen next. And make sure to subscribe for more emotionally gripping tales like this one. Before the betrayal shattered my world, there were signs, small fractures in my relationships with both Vivian and Rowan that I chose to ignore or dismiss as temporary. Looking back now, it's clear those cracks weren't new. They'd been forming for months, hidden beneath layers of routine and familiarity. But denial is a powerful thing. It allows you to convince yourself that everything is fine when deep down, you know it isn't. It started subtly, a shift so gradual I barely noticed it at first. Vivienne began spending more time at her boutique, claiming she needed to focus on expanding her business. At first, I believed her. Her career had always been important to her, and I wanted to support her dreams. But over time, her absences grew longer and her explanations less convincing. Another late night, I'd ask casually, trying to mask the irritation creeping into my voice. "Yeah," she'd reply, avoiding eye contact. "Deadlines don't wait." Her answer didn't satisfy me. It never did anymore. But I nodded anyway, unwilling to push further. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. And besides, what if I was wrong? What if the problem really was as simple as stress? But then came the excuses, the missed family dinners, the canceled plans, the vague responses whenever I asked how her day went. Once, when I suggested we spend a weekend away together, she brushed me off with a laugh. "You know I can't just drop everything," she said lightly, though her tone carried an edge I couldn't quite place. Meanwhile, Rowan became equally distant. He stopped showing up for our weekly basketball games, claiming he was swamped with client projects. When I invited him over for dinner, he declined, saying he already had plans. Plans with whom? I wondered silently, but never voiced aloud. The tension between us wasn't just limited to Vivienne and me, it extended to Rowan as well. There were moments when I caught them exchanging glances across the room, their expressions unreadable. Once, during a family barbecue, I overheard Vivienne whispering to Rowan about timing and patience. When I approached, they quickly changed the subject, laughing loudly about some inside joke I wasn't privy to. "What's so funny?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Oh, nothing," Vivienne replied quickly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Just silly stuff." Rowan chimed in, his tone overly casual. "Yeah, nothing important." Their behavior gnawed at me, planting seeds of doubt I tried desperately to ignore. Was I imagining things? Overanalyzing innocent interactions? Or was there something more going on beneath the surface? Despite the growing distance, we still made efforts to maintain appearances, to keep up the illusion of normalcy. We celebrated milestones like birthdays and anniversaries, exchanged gifts during holidays, and attended social events together as a couple. To outsiders, we probably seemed happy, even enviable. But behind closed doors, the cracks were widening. One evening, after putting away the dishes, I found Vivienne sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her brow was furrowed, her fingers tapping nervously against the screen. When I sat beside her, she startled, quickly locking her phone and setting it aside. "Everything okay?" I asked, studying her face. She hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just work stuff." Her evasiveness stung, though I didn't let it show. Instead, I reached for her hand, hoping to bridge the gap between us. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." For a moment, she looked like she might open up. Then she smiled faintly, squeezing my hand. "I know. Thanks." But the moment passed, leaving behind an emptiness I couldn't shake. Even amidst the growing tension, there were fleeting moments of hope, glimpses of the life we used to share. One Saturday morning, Vivienne surprised me with breakfast in bed. Pancakes shaped like hearts, fresh fruit, and coffee brewed exactly the way I liked it. "I miss us," she admitted softly, sitting beside me. "I feel like we've been drifting apart lately." Her vulnerability caught me off guard, melting some of the resentment I'd been harboring. "Me too," I replied, reaching for her hand. "Let's fix it, together." For a brief moment, it felt like old times, the kind of connection that made me believe we could overcome anything. But the reprieve was short-lived. By the end of the day, the tension returned, stronger than ever. Whatever progress we'd made evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Looking back, I realized those moments of closeness were fleeting because they weren't built on honesty. Beneath the surface, Vivienne carried a secret too heavy to share, one that would eventually destroy everything we'd worked so hard to build. The signs were there if I'd only paid attention. Her reluctance to discuss the past, her defensiveness whenever I asked about her relationship with Rowan, the way she sometimes looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite place. Guilt, regret, love. But I ignored them all, choosing instead to cling to the illusion of perfection. After all, admitting the truth meant facing a reality too painful to bear. So I buried my doubts, focusing instead on the life we'd created, the life I believed was ours. Little did I know, the foundation of that life was built on sand, destined to crumble the moment the tide rolled in. The cracks in our relationships widened with each passing day until the space between us felt like an unbridgeable chasm. What had once been a sanctuary of shared laughter and whispered dreams now felt suffocating, a house filled with echoes of what we used to be. We were still living under the same roof, but emotionally, we existed on separate planets. Our conversations dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about groceries or bills, devoid of warmth or intimacy. Even when we sat inches apart on the couch, the silence between us was deafening, heavy, with everything left unsaid. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find Vivienne sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. Without thinking, I snapped, "Why are you just sitting here? Dinner isn't even started." Her head jerked up, surprise quickly giving way to anger. "Excuse me," she shot back, her voice sharp. "Maybe if you didn't work yourself into the ground every single day, we wouldn't have these problems." My jaw tightened as resentment bubbled to the surface. "Oh, I'm the problem. Funny, because last I checked, you've been distant and distracted for weeks. How am I supposed to fix things when you won't even tell me what's wrong?" For a moment, we stared at each other, the air crackling with unresolved tension. Then, without another word, Vivienne stormed out of the room, leaving me standing alone amidst the wreckage of yet another failed attempt at connection. These arguments became a recurring pattern, small misunderstandings escalating into full-blown fights, fueled by frustration and exhaustion. Each confrontation drove us further apart, creating new wounds while reopening old ones. The love we once shared hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had become buried beneath layers of mistrust, guilt, and unspoken fears. Rowan's presence only added fuel to the fire. He began stopping by the house more often, always finding excuses to see Vivienne. Once I overheard them laughing in the kitchen, their voices low and conspiratorial. When I walked in, they both fell silent, exchanging a glance that made my stomach churn. "Hey," Rowan said casually, though his tone carried an edge. "Just grabbing some coffee with V." Vivienne forced a smile, avoiding my gaze. "Yeah, just catching up." Catching up? About what? Their behavior gnawed at me, twisting my thoughts into knots. I hated myself for feeling this way, for letting insecurity creep in and poison what little trust remained. Yet I couldn't shake the fear that they were growing closer in ways I didn't want to imagine. The jealousy consumed me, manifesting in irrational outbursts and accusations. One night, after Vivienne returned late from work, I confronted her in the hallway. "Where were you?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "At the boutique," she replied, her tone clipped. "Where else would I be?" "With Rowan," I shot back before I could stop myself. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with indignation. "Are you serious right now? You think I'm sneaking around with your brother?" "I don't know what to think anymore," I shouted, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "You're always with him, always making excuses." She stared at me, hurt flashing across her face before hardening into anger. "If you can't trust me, maybe we shouldn't be together." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Was that what this was coming to? A relationship built on suspicion and doubt instead of love and understanding? Despite the growing rift, there were still moments of hope, fleeting glimpses of the life we used to share. One morning, Vivienne surprised me with breakfast in bed, her apology written in pancakes and fresh fruit. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, the kind of connection that made me believe we could overcome anything. But the reprieve was short-lived. By the end of the day, the tension returned, stronger than ever. Whatever progress we'd made evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The breaking point came during a family dinner at my parents' house. Vivienne had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, picking at her food with disinterest. At one point, my mother leaned across the table, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Have you two thought about names yet?" she asked, assuming Vivienne's frequent absences were due to pregnancy. Vivienne froze, her fork hovering midair. Beside her, I felt my stomach twist into knots. Before she could respond, I interjected hastily, "We're still deciding." "It's harder than it looks." My mother laughed, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. But Vivian's reaction, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. Her forced smile didn't reach her eyes, and her hands trembled ever so slightly as she set down her utensils. That night, as we drove home in silence, I finally confronted her. "Why did you lie to me, Vivi?" I demanded, my voice raw with emotion. "If you're not pregnant, just tell me. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." For a brief moment, I thought she might confess. Tears welled in her eyes, and she opened her mouth as if to speak. But then she shook her head, her resolve hardening. "You wouldn't understand," she muttered, staring straight ahead. "Then help me understand," I shot back, gripping the steering wheel tighter, "because right now, I feel like I don't know you at all." The rest of the ride passed in tense silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time we reached home, the air between us was thick with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. We went to bed without another word, the chasm between us wider than ever. In the weeks that followed, denial became our default mode. We continued going through the motions, attending appointments, discussing nursery designs, even hosting a small baby shower organized by Vivian's sister. But the cracks in our foundation were impossible to ignore. Our once effortless connection had fractured, replaced by awkward exchanges and fleeting glances that hinted at deeper turmoil. Yet amidst the chaos, moments of hope flickered like candlelight in a storm. There were nights when Vivian would curl up beside me, her head resting on my chest as though seeking solace. Other times, she'd surprise me with gestures reminiscent of the woman I fell in love with, a handwritten note tucked into my bag, a playlist curated specifically for me, a spontaneous hug that lingered longer than expected. These glimpses of the old Vivian kept me tethered, fueling my belief that we could salvage what remained of our relationship. But deep down, I knew the truth. Until she faced whatever demons drove her to deceive me, healing would remain elusive. The tension between Vivian and me reached a boiling point one rainy evening, the kind of storm that seemed to mirror the chaos brewing inside our home. I had just returned from work, exhausted and drenched, only to find her sitting at the kitchen table with Rowan. Their heads were bent close together, whispering urgently, and when they noticed me standing in the doorway, their conversation halted abruptly. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight with suspicion. "Nothing," Vivian replied quickly, her tone defensive. "Rowan just stopped by to drop something off." "To drop what off?" I pressed, stepping further into the room. My eyes darted between them, searching for answers neither was willing to give. Rowan stood up, his expression unreadable. "It's not important," he said, brushing past me toward the door. "I'll see you later, V." As soon as he left, I turned to Vivian, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Why is he always here? Why are you always making excuses for him?" Her face flushed with frustration. "You're being ridiculous. He's your brother. Can't we spend time together without you accusing us of something?" "Then tell me the truth," I shouted, slamming my fist against the counter. "Tell me why you've been lying to me, why you've been pulling away, why—" "I'm not lying," she interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. But even as she said it, her voice faltered, betraying the guilt she'd been carrying. For weeks, maybe months, I'd suspected there was more to their relationship than either of them admitted, but hearing her hesitate now confirmed everything I'd feared. The betrayal sliced through me like a knife, leaving me breathless. "You're sleeping with him, aren't you?" I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Vivian froze, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it. Then, slowly, she nodded, her shoulders sagging under the weight of confession. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It started innocently enough. We were just talking, spending time together. And then, I don't know how it happened. It spiraled out of control." Every word felt like a punch to the gut. Not only had she betrayed me, but she'd done it with my own brother, the person I trusted most in the world. Betrayal didn't begin to cover it. This was devastation, pure and unrelenting. "And Rowan?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Does he feel the same way? Or was this just some game to him?" She hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to him and honesty with me. Finally, she admitted, "He loves me. And I care about him too." Her admission shattered whatever remained of my composure. I grabbed my coat and stormed out of the house, unable to bear another second in the same space as her. The rain soaked through my clothes as I walked aimlessly, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. How could two people I loved so deeply hurt me like this? When I finally returned hours later, Vivienne was gone. On the dining table, she'd left a note scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. "I can't stay here anymore. Please don't hate me." Her absence left a void I couldn't fill, a silence that echoed louder than any argument ever could. Days turned into weeks, during which I threw myself into work, using deadlines and meetings as distractions from the emptiness threatening to consume me. Friends called and texted, offering support and advice, but their well-meaning words only reminded me of how isolated I felt. Without Vivienne, the world seemed duller, quieter, as though someone had turned down the volume on life itself. Then, unexpectedly, a call came that changed everything. It was Delaney, Vivienne's sister, her voice urgent and strained. "You need to come to the hospital," she said without preamble. "It's Vivienne." My blood ran cold. What happened? "She collapsed earlier today," Delaney explained quickly. "They're running tests now, but it doesn't look good." Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and raced to the hospital, my mind a whirlwind of fear and dread. When I arrived, Delaney met me in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. "They found tumors," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Brain tumors. They're saying it's advanced." The room spun around me as her words sank in. Vivienne, my fierce, vibrant Vivienne, was sick. Terminal illness wasn't something we'd ever imagined facing, especially not now, when our relationship was already hanging by a thread. I rushed to her bedside, where she lay hooked up to machines, her frail form dwarfed by the sterile hospital sheets. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard my footsteps, and for a brief moment, relief washed over her features. "You came," she murmured weakly, reaching for my hand. "Of course I came," I replied, gripping her fingers tightly. "I'm not going anywhere." As I sat beside her, watching her struggle to stay awake, something shifted within me. The anger, the betrayal, the resentment. It all faded into the background, replaced by a single, overwhelming realization. I still loved her. More than anything, I wanted to fight for her, to be there for her in whatever time we had left together. Over the following days, Vivienne and I embarked on a journey neither of us had anticipated, rebuilding trust while grappling with the uncertainty of her prognosis. It wasn't easy. There were moments when fear threatened to consume us, when the weight of her diagnosis loomed so heavily that breathing felt impossible. But slowly, incrementally, we found ways to reconnect. Not as lovers clinging desperately to the past, but as two people determined to cherish whatever time they had left together. One afternoon, as we sat in the hospital garden, Vivienne turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Remember that road trip we took last summer?" she asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "How could I forget? You got us lost 3 times before we finally found that diner with the world's best pie." She laughed softly, the sound like music after months of silence. "We should do it again," she said, her expression turning serious. Not the getting lost part, obviously. Just go somewhere, anywhere, make some memories while we still can. Her request caught me off guard, but deep down I knew she was right. Life, no matter how fleeting, deserved to be lived fully. So, against medical advice and logistical challenges, we planned a trip. A modest one given her condition, but meaningful nonetheless. We rented a small cabin near a lake, far removed from the sterile walls of hospitals and the relentless ticking of clocks. Those days at the lake became some of the most beautiful of our lives. We spent mornings fishing off the dock, afternoons exploring nearby trails, and evenings curled up by the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter until our sides ached. On the final night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Vivienne leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for this, for giving me peace." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but I managed a smile. "Thank you," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "for reminding me what love really means." Time, however, is an unforgiving force. Despite our efforts to create joy in the present, Vivienne's health continued to decline. By winter, she was back in the hospital, weaker than before, but still fighting with every ounce of strength she had. One snowy evening, as I sat beside her bed reading aloud from one of her favorite novels, she interrupted me mid-sentence. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of machines. "Anything," I replied without hesitation. "When I'm gone," she began, pausing to gather her breath. "Don't stop living. Don't let grief keep you trapped in the past. Promise me you'll find happiness again, even if it's not with me." Her request shattered me, but I nodded through my tears. "I promise," I choked out, clutching her hand tightly. "But you're not going anywhere yet. Not tonight, not tomorrow." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing as exhaustion claimed her. That night marked the beginning of the end, a slow, painful unraveling that tested every fiber of my being. When Vivian passed away 2 weeks later, surrounded by loved ones and bathed in soft candlelight, I felt as though a part of me died with her. In the months that followed, grief consumed me. Days blurred into nights, each one heavier than the last. Yet even in the depths of despair, Vivian's final wish echoed in my mind: find happiness again. At first, the idea seemed impossible. How could I move forward without her? How could anyone else measure up to the love we'd shared? But healing isn't linear, and neither is growth. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. The writer who once dreamed of crafting epic tales, the adventurer who craved exploration, the friend who valued connection above all else. I started journaling, pouring my emotions onto paper in hopes of making sense of them. I reconnected with old friends, leaning on their support during dark times. And eventually, I returned to the places Vivian and I had loved together, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what had been. One spring afternoon, while hiking a trail we'd visited during happier times, I stumbled upon a patch of wildflowers blooming defiantly against the rocky terrain. They reminded me of Vivian, resilient, vibrant, unforgettable. As I knelt to take a closer look, I realized something profound. Love doesn't die when someone leaves. It transforms. It becomes a part of you, shaping who you are and guiding you toward the future. And so, here I am today, scarred but whole, heartbroken but hopeful. Love taught me many lessons, but perhaps the greatest was this: even in loss, there is light, if only we have the courage to seek it.